When Clara Wren crossed into Briar Cut with 14 acres of bad shale in her pocket and a crate of 15 screaming Guinea hens tied to the back of her wagon, the entire street went quiet for half a second. Then it broke open laughing, not soft laughing, the kind of laughing people do when they believe the verdict has already been read. Those birds sounded like a hinge tearing loose from a burning barn. They flung themselves against the slats. They shrieked at the horses, at the dust, at the sky, at nothing. And Clara kept both hands on the reins. Because what nobody in Briar Cut knew, not the men outside the feed store, not the women watching from the mercantile door, not the rancher who was already measuring her land in his mind, was that those ugly, useless-looking birds were about to become the only reason their valley still had children in their beds, cattle in their pastures, and farms left to argue over. The town heard noise. Clara heard a pattern, and that difference was going to matter more than money, more than pride, and more than every land deed Victor Cale had ever folded into a lawyer's envelope. Briar Cut was not much of a town. A rail stop that had never quite become a rail stop. A dry main street with a livery, a feed store, a mercantile, a blacksmith shop, and a row of buildings so sun-bleached they looked less built than left behind. The country around it was worse: brown scrub, hard creek beds, limestone shelves hidden under thin soil, wind that seemed to arrive already angry. Clara had come from 3 counties east with $38.60 sewn into the lining of her skirt, a skillet, 2 blankets, 1 sack of bean seed, and a deed her dead aunt had sent her by way of a clerk who had used the word unpromising 3 times in one conversation. The deed said 14 acres on the North Wash. The clerk had said it like a warning. Clara had heard it like a beginning. By the time she stopped in front of the claims office, half the town had seen the crate. A man by the pump called out, "Those chickens sick, miss." Another said, "No, that's just how failure sounds." Laughter ran down the street in a clean little wave. Clara did not turn. She had learned early that people who wanted a reaction were not owed one. Inside the claims office, Milton Sayer looked over the deed, then over Clara, then through the front window at the crate that was still shouting at the world. He was a narrow man with ink on 2 fingers, and the permanent caution of someone who had watched hope ruin people on paper. "You are Lottie Wren's niece," he said. "I am. You have seen the ground." "Not yet." He leaned back carefully, as if the chair belonged to someone stricter than he was. "Then let me tell you plainly. The Wren parcel has beaten 3 families and 2 partnerships. Nothing deep-rooted takes. The topsoil is shallow. The wash floods in hard rain and disappears in dry months. Your aunt held it because she was stubborn, not because it was good." Clara folded her hands over the edge of the desk. "How long before someone can challenge the claim?" Sayer's eyes sharpened. "Victor Cale has asked that same question twice this year." There it was. She had heard the name before she ever reached town. Victor Cale owned cattle, a grain contract, 2 warehouse leases, and enough council favors to make small men sit straighter when he came into a room. He had been buying failed parcels along the North Wash for nearly 2 years. Sayer lowered his voice. "There is a use and improvement requirement. If the land sits idle, a competing claim can be made. If you occupy it, improve it, and document the work, you have protection." "How much documentation?" "As much as you can keep." Clara nodded once. "Then I need a register book." Sayer looked surprised. "Most people ask about water first." "I will look at the water when I get there." He found her a ruled ledger with a cracked black cover. She paid for it out of the skirt lining, took the receipt, and left with her deed, her ledger, and 15 furious birds still making every dog in Briar Cut lose its mind. The land was exactly as bad as advertised. Clara arrived near sundown and sat on the wagon bench longer than she meant to. 14 acres of rough wash, thorn scrub, broken limestone, and a cabin that had lost one wall and most of its dignity. A thin creek ran along the back line, not full but not dead either. The lower ground near it showed a darker skin of soil. The slope above it was dry and bitter-looking. The old fence leaned like it had been trying to leave for years. She stepped down, walked the boundary until the light thinned, and tried to see the place without wishing it were easier. That was how her mother had taught her to survive. Do not ask trouble to be fair. Ask what it is made of. The creek meant moisture. The scrub meant insect life. The slope meant drainage. The stones meant heat would hold after sundown. None of that was a farm. Not yet. But it was an argument. A small one. A practical one. The next morning she opened the crate. The guinea hens came out like they had been personally insulted by imprisonment and planned to file complaints with the sky. 15 gray speckled bodies scattered into the scrub, necks stretched, heads jerking, feet quick and deliberate. Clara did not chase them. She watched. Most farmers she had known treated birds like either eggs or meat. Clara had learned differently from an old widow in Rock County who kept guinea fowl around her dairy shed. Not because they were pretty, not because they were pleasant, because they noticed what people missed. For 3 days, Clara did almost nothing but observe. She slept under patched canvas against the half-standing cabin wall. She boiled creek water. She mended fence corners. She set down a little grain at dusk and learned which birds came close and which stayed wild. And she wrote, North slope, birds ignore bare shale. Creek edge, heavy work in leaf litter. East scrub, constant picking under thorn. No crop damage. On the 4th morning the flock reached a pocket of low brush near the wash and stopped all at once. The noise changed, not louder, different. A rough, nervous rattling passed through them. They spread in a crescent around the brush but would not enter it. Clara crouched and parted the dead grass with a stick. The ground seemed to move. Ticks, not a few, not the ordinary nuisance any scrubland carried. A living pepper scattered through the leaf mold, crawling up stems, clinging to the shaded undersides, waiting for warmth, breath, blood. Clara stepped back very carefully. The birds worked the rim of that patch for almost an hour. Anything that crossed out, they took. Anything that climbed high, they took. They did not clear the brush. They did not tear the ground. They made a moving border around the infestation and fed until the crescent of danger narrowed. Clara opened the black ledger and wrote the line that would later become the center of everything. They are not random. Follow the pattern. The first person in Briar Cut who did not laugh at her was Abram Pike. He came to the fence 6 days after her arrival, an old orchard man with a white beard cut short, a walking stick, and eyes that still knew how to measure ground. Clara saw him standing by the lower gate and walked over. If you came for the entertainment, she said, the birds do 2 shows a day and complain through both. Abram looked at the flock moving through the thorn. My mother kept those in Alabama before the war, he said. Meanest birds God ever permitted, best tick hunters I ever saw. Something inside Clara, something she had not realized, was braced, loosened by one notch. You want to see what they found? He did. They walked the wash together. Clara showed him the tick pocket, the bird paths, the places where the soil stayed darker after their daily circuits. Abram did not interrupt. He listened in the old farmer's way, not just to her words, but to the ground under them. After a long while, he said, this valley has been sick since last summer. Sick how? Cattle fever, horse fever, hides crawling by August. The dry years kept everybody thinking about water. But it is not just water. He touched the end of his stick to a patch of grass. Something is breeding in the brush. Clara looked toward the gray birds threading the slope. Tinkles, yes, how bad? Abram's face did not change, which was how she knew the answer mattered. Bad enough that men with better land than yours are losing animals they cannot replace. The second person who spoke plainly to her was Ruth Bell at the Mercantile. Ruth was a square-shouldered widow with sharp eyes, faster hands, and the talent of making gossip sound like inventory. She put flour, coffee, lamp oil, and salt on Clara's side of the counter before Clara finished reading her list. "Victor Cayley asked after you," Ruth said. Clara kept her face still. "When?" "Yesterday." "What did he want?" "To know whether you had moved in or only arrived." "Which answer did you give him?" Ruth tied a paper packet with string. "The true one, that you looked like someone too stubborn to turn around early." Clara almost smiled. Ruth did not. "Listen carefully. Cale wants the North Wash because the survey men have been sniffing around that line. If a spur route ever comes through, every worthless parcel out there stops being worthless. He has money, lawyers, and patience. What he does not have is your signature. He will not get it. Plenty of people say that before winter." Clara slid coins across the counter. "Then I better have something besides a sentence." Ruth looked at the coins, then at Clara's work-rough hands. "You need to become useful faster than he can make you look foolish." On her way back to the wagon, Clara saw a boy standing beside the hitch rail, pretending not to stare at the guinea hens. He was thin, maybe 12, maybe 13, with a patched coat too heavy for the weather and the solemn face of a child who had learned not to expect much and was offended by almost everything anyway. "You like birds?" Clara asked. "No," the crate screamed. The boy watched it. "They are terrible," he said. "They are. Why bring terrible birds? Because terrible is not the same as useless." He looked at her then, not laughing, measuring. "What do? They find what the land is hiding." His name was Eli Rusk. He lived with cousins who had more children than money and more patience than food. He came to Clara's fence 2 mornings later, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on the flock. Clara let him stand there for 10 minutes before she said, "You going to watch from the road forever?" "I am not bothering anything." "No, but you are wasting the good view." He came through the gate like he expected the ground to charge him rent. She showed him what the birds did. Within an hour, Eli noticed something she had not. "They turn back before they hit the thickest brush," he said. "They do. But they do not avoid it because they are scared." "What makes you say that?" He pointed. "They send the bold ones close, then the rest spread. It is like they are testing how bad it is." Clara studied the flock. He was right. By noon he had named the smallest hen Queen Mab because he said she acted like she owned more country than she could defend. Clara told him not to name working animals. Eli named 3 more by supper. He came back the next day, and the next. She could not pay him, so she fed him. Beans, corn cakes, coffee with more water than coffee in it. He took the food without making gratitude into a performance, which Clara appreciated. In return, he carried water, mended fence, learned the flock calls, and watched the birds with a concentration so fierce it made adults look half asleep. By the 3rd week, he could walk through the guinea hens without scattering them. By the 5th, he knew their routes better than Clara did. By the 6th, he said, "Your map is wrong." Clara looked up from the garden bed she was building with creek silt and rotted leaves. "My map, the one in your ledger. You drew the north slope as 1 zone, but the birds treat it like 3. The upper stones, the thorn strip, and the rabbit grass. They do not work those the same way." Clara opened the ledger and studied the page. He was right again. She tore a thin line through her original mark and drew 3 zones. Eli tried not to look pleased. He failed. Victor Kao came in early June. He arrived on a polished bay horse and did not dismount at first, which told Clara most of what she needed to know about him. A man who stayed above another person during a negotiation either liked height or needed it. Cale was broad, well-dressed, and comfortable. In his own silence, his hat was clean. His boots were better than anyone's boots needed to be on a wash road. His eyes moved over Clara's fence repairs, the creek silt beds, the birds in the scrub, the crooked cabin wall now braced with new timber. "Miss Wren," he said, "I am Victor Kale. I know." A small adjustment passed through his expression. "Then you know I hold the grazing leases north of here. I know you want my land." That made him smile. "Direct good. I prefer direct dealings, do you? I prefer efficient ones." He looked over the parcel as if seeing the future version of it, not the current one. "This ground has broken better-backed people than you. I can offer you cash now, more than its present value, and save you the long humiliation of learning what everyone else already learned." Clara wiped creek mud from her hands onto her skirt. "What is its present value? Low. Then why pay more?" His smile cooled. "Because the parcel sits inconveniently. For you. For a number of future uses, the kind that need a rail spur." This time the adjustment was not small enough to hide. Behind Clara, Queen Mab screamed from the scrub like she had an opinion on land speculation. Kale looked at the bird. "What exactly are you doing with those?" "Listening." He laughed once lightly, as if she had made a charming rustic joke. Clara did not laugh with him. Kale gathered the reins. "My offer will remain open for now. You will find that Briar Cut is not kind to experiments." "No," Clara said. "It has been very clear about that." He tipped his hat and rode away. Eli, who had been behind the cabin stacking stone and hearing everything, came around the corner after the horse disappeared. "He is afraid of the birds," the boy said. Clara looked at him. "He is afraid of what he cannot price." That summer the valley got hotter, then sicker. The rains did not come when they should have. The creek sank to a chain of shallow pools. Gardens in the lower valley yellowed at the edges, then failed in whole rows. Cattle began rubbing themselves raw against posts. Horses stood with their heads down under shade, hide twitching. At the Bell Place, 2 calves died in a week. At the Naylor Orchard, workers refused to enter the lower windbreak because they came out with ticks crawling past their boot tops. At the schoolhouse, 3 children were sent home with fever. Clara's land did not thrive in any pretty sense. It fought, but it kept producing. The bean rows in the creek beds came up strong. Squash held where she had layered leaves and creek silt. The upper slope where the guinea hens worked daily showed almost no chewing damage. The birds dropped nitrogen into the soil and scratched the top skin loose without tearing roots. They hunted the destructive insects, but left enough of the soil life to turn rot into food. Clara could not yet name the whole system, so she measured what she could. Tick drags with a square of white cloth, plant height, leaf damage, bird routes, moisture depth after watering. By late July, her ledger had become less a record than a language. Eli added his own marks in the margins, a cross for heavy work, a circle for nesting behavior, a little jagged line for places where the birds made warning noise. One evening, Abram Pike stood over her bean rows and said, "This soil should not be holding like this. No, it is the birds. Yes, not just ticks. No." He crouched slowly, knees complaining, and took a pinch of soil between his fingers. "Your aunt tried to plow this wash flat. Before her, the Bender brothers scraped the scrub and planted corn like this was river bottom. They all tried to make this ground behave like better ground." He let the soil fall. "You let the birds teach you what kind of ground it is." Clara looked at the slope, where the gray shapes moved through the thorn with their ugly, tireless purpose. "I did not have enough money to do it the wrong way." Abram gave a dry little laugh. "Poverty saves people from expensive mistakes sometimes. Not often enough. No, not often enough." By August, Ruth Bell was extending Clara credit without calling it charity. And 2 women who had laughed at her in May were buying small baskets of squash from the mercantile, without mentioning where Ruth had gotten them. The town had stopped laughing the same way. That did not mean it trusted her. It only meant the laughter had begun to cost too much. Then the fever took Martin Klein. He was 24, a ranch hand on the Naylor place, newly married, expecting his first child. He came down hot on a Sunday and was dead by Thursday. Dr. Elias Vail called it spotted fever, tick-borne. After that, Briar Cut changed temperature, not the air, the people. Fear moved into their conversations and made them shorter. Men checked their trouser cuffs on the street. Mothers kept children from the scrub. Ranchers burned brush piles that only sent smoke across the valley and drove ticks outward into new ground. Clara heard the news from Eli, who arrived pale and tight-lipped. Dr. Vail says there is no sure medicine. There is not, Clara said. He says you survive the fever or you do not. Yes, Eli looked toward the birds. Then the answer is before the bite. Clara set down the bucket she was carrying. Yes, you have the answer. I have part of one. No. His voice sharpened. You have the only part that is working. She wanted to correct him, to explain scale, to explain risk, to explain that 15 birds had become 22, not 200. That her own land was only stable because the flock knew it. That if she split them too early, she could lose the balance on the one parcel, proving the method. But the truth sat there between them, a dead man, a rising tick count. A town that had laughed at the only working tool in the valley. That night, Clara found the boundary problem. She had been dragging the white cloth along the lower fence, the same way every other evening, when it came up black-spicked near the eastern wash line. 56 ticks on one drag. Her interior zones were counting 0 to 3. The eastern line counted 56. She crossed the fence into public scrub and dragged again. 71. The public wash ran like a vein from the open range straight toward Briar Cuts, backlots thick with grass, leaf litter, rabbit runs, and nobody responsible for any of it. The town was not just surrounded by ticks. It had a delivery route. Clara stood there until dusk made the cloth hard to see. Then she walked back to the cabin, opened a new page in the ledger, and wrote, "The farm can hold itself, the valley cannot." Under that she wrote, "This cannot remain private." The next morning she went to Dr. Vail. His office was behind the blacksmith shop. One room with a medicine cabinet, 2 cots, a washstand, and a smell of carbolic soap that could not fully defeat sickness. Vail looked younger than Clara expected and more tired than young men like to look. "I wondered when you would come," he said. "How many cases? Confirmed, 9. Probable, more, 1 death, 2 severe. How fast?" "Fast enough that if this week becomes next week doubled, I cannot manage it." She laid out her counts. The interior numbers, the boundary numbers, the public wash, the bird behavior. The way the bell cattle had begun avoiding the lower brush before the calves died. Vail read the ledger pages with a physician's stillness. Then he said, "What do you need?" "Authority." He looked up. "Not over people. Over the plan. The town council will not listen to a woman with birds until someone with a title tells them the birds matter." Vail closed the ledger carefully. "I can tell them the fever is tick-borne. I can tell them your land is the only surveyed place showing suppression. I can recommend trial intervention. That is enough. It may not be. Victor Cale has already offered to organize a response." Of course he had. Clara felt the old cold settle behind her ribs. What kind? Central purchase. Outside birds. His men to manage deployment. A fee structure for participating properties. So he controls the cure. Vail did not soften it, yes. And the families who cannot pay, they become indebted or excluded. Clara took her ledger back. "Council meets when?" "Tomorrow evening. I need to speak before him." Vail studied her. "You have never been popular here." "Miss Wren." "No, that may help." For the first time, Clara smiled. Fear makes people reconsider popularity. The council room was the back of the feed store. It smelled like grain dust, tobacco, and damp wool, even though the evening was hot. 5 councilmen sat at a long table. Victor Kale sat near the front with 2 folded papers and the calm of a man who expected procedure to behave. Ruth Bell stood at the back with her arms crossed. Abram Pike leaned on his stick beside the door. Dr. Vale sat where everyone could see him and no one could avoid him. Clara placed her black ledger on the table. No speech came easily to her. She was not a woman who enjoyed convincing people. She preferred proof to do its own walking. So she opened the ledger and made the proof walk. She showed them 8 weeks of drag counts. Her land, the public wash, the bell boundary, the bird routes. She explained the tick life cycle in plain language. Eggs in leaf litter, young stages in the low damp layer, nymphs climbing grass, adults finding animals. She explained that killing what was visible after fever arrived was too late. The cycle had to be broken where it lived. Then she said the sentence that turned the room. My farm is not clean because it is lucky. It is clean because the birds have been interrupting that cycle every day since May. Councilman Hobb, the banker, frowned at the ledger. You are asking us to buy birds? No. Not first. Kale shifted slightly. Clara continued. I am asking for a 6-week public rotation. My flock remains under my management. Small groups move through the highest risk zones. Host families supply grain and water. The council authorizes access to the public wash and records the results. If the counts drop, we continue. If they do not, you have lost grain, not a valley. The room murmured. Kale stood. It was not dramatic. That was his gift. He never looked like a man interrupting. He looked like a man restoring order. Miss Wren has made an admirable effort, he said. But public health should not rest on a private experiment. I have contacted a breeder in Abilene. With proper funding, we can bring in a flock large enough to address the entire valley under professional oversight. And when would they arrive? Clara asked. Kale smiled as if answering a child. Logistics take time. How much? 3 to 5 weeks. And how long before unfamiliar birds settle enough to work terrain effectively? His smile thinned. That depends. 4 weeks if you are lucky. 6 if you are not. That is 7 to 11 weeks before your plan begins to work. Clara turned to the council. Dr. Vale has just told you he cannot afford next week doubled. Vale did not speak. He did not need to. Councilman Fitch, who ran the feed store and had said nothing until then, tapped the ledger. These are your counts. Yes. Who verified them? Ellie Rusk witnessed many. Abram Pike witnessed some. Dr. Vale can verify the disease pattern. Not the bird work, Kale said gently. A child and an old man. Ruth Bell spoke from the back. And a ledger with more numbers than your proposal has, Victor. The room tightened. Fitch looked toward Clara. Who is Eli Rusk in this plan? My assistant. A few men shifted. The word sounded too formal for an orphan boy with torn cuffs. Clara let it stand. He knows the flock by individual markings. He can train host families in daily handling. He can read the birds' working patterns faster than anyone else here, including me. Kale's voice stayed mild. And if this assistant makes a mistake, Clara looked at him, then I will document it, correct it, and continue, which is more than the valley can do with fever. The council voted for a trial, 4 to 1. Kale's face did not change. That worried Clara more than anger would have. The first rotation began at dawn 2 days later. 6 birds to the public wash, 7 to the Bell lower pasture, 5 to the schoolhouse scrub line. The remaining flock stayed on Clara's land, too small now for comfort, but enough if she watched tightly and shifted the routes by feed placement. Eli ran the schoolhouse group. He showed Mrs. Naylor how to set water low enough for the birds but out of reach of dogs. He showed the bellboys how to move quietly behind a flock instead of chasing it. He explained, with grave irritation, that Guinea fowl did not obey like dogs, did not forgive like horses, and did not respect shouting from anyone. The first week was chaos. The birds screamed. Children climbed fences to look. 2 hens escaped the schoolhouse enclosure and were recovered from the cemetery. 1 bell cow charged a water pan, and then spent the next hour being scolded by Queen Mab, who had apparently decided the cow was an administrative problem. But the counts moved. Not everywhere, not evenly, but enough. Public wash, 71 to 48. Schoolhouse scrub, 34 to 19. Bell lower pasture, 82 to 51. Then, on the 9th day, someone opened the public wash gate after dark. Eli found it at sunrise, no birds lost, only because they had roosted high in the thorn and refused to step through the open gate before light. The latch was not broken. The chain had been lifted and set carefully on the post. Clara said nothing when Eli told her. She replaced the latch with a wire twist that needed 2 hands and left a strip of flour-dusted cloth tied where any hand opening it would mark itself. 2 nights later, the water barrel at the schoolhouse group was tipped over. The next morning, Councilman Briggs appeared with a notebook and asked Eli how many birds had gone missing, whether Clara had overestimated her control, and whether the flock might be spreading disease by moving between properties. Eli answered every question honestly. Then he rode straight back to Clara. "He is not asking to learn," Eli said. "He is asking to write." Clara felt a tired pride in him. "That is exactly right. What do we do? What we should have done from the beginning. We make the record stronger than the rumor." From that day forward, every rotation had 2 logs. Clara's and the host families. Every gate latch was checked and initialed. Every bird was counted by marking. Every water barrel filled and witnessed. Every tick drag recorded with date, weather, ground condition, and person present. Cale had money. Clara had pattern. And she was learning to make pattern hard to dismiss. The fever curve began to bend in the 3rd week. Dr. Vail noticed it first. New cases slowed. The schoolhouse children recovered. Mrs. Bell's nephew, who had spent 6 days sweating through sheets, sat up and asked for broth. No new death came after Martin Klein. Briar Cut did not celebrate. People in fear do not trust relief right away. They wait to see whether it holds. But their faces changed when Clara passed, not gratitude yet. Attention. And attention was the first door she needed. Victor Cale made his mistake in the feed store. Clara had come for nails and cracked corn. Cale stood near the counter with Councilman Briggs, speaking low enough that he meant not to be heard, but high enough that he meant to be noticed. When Clara entered, he turned with an easy smile. "Miss Wren, I am glad to hear your little birds are surviving the work. Most things survive better when no one opens their gates." A flicker crossed Briggs's face. Cale's smile did not move. "I had heard one of your marked hens went missing. The pale-faced one with the black slash near the throat. Shame if the record becomes untidy." The feed store went still. Clara did not answer too quickly. The pale-faced hen with the black slash was named Lampwick by Eli and tolerated by no one. Clara had documented her in the ledger because she used that bird to track stress behavior between the creek line and the schoolhouse scrub. But that description had never been in any council summary. It had never been spoken in a meeting. It had never been printed on a public sheet. And Lampwick was not missing. She had been moved back to Clara's home flock 3 days earlier after showing nesting behavior under the wrong roof. Clara set the sack of cracked corn on the counter. "Who told you that bird was missing?" Cale's silence lasted only a breath too long. "Town talk. Town talk knows throat markings now," he gave a soft laugh. "You are tired, Miss Wren. Tired people sharpen harmless remarks. Careless people make revealing ones." Ruth Bell, behind the counter, had stopped tying a package. Cale's eyes slid toward her, then back to Clara. "Be careful," he said. It was the first honest thing he had said to her. That evening, Clara and Eli checked every flock. All birds present. At the public wash gate, they found boot prints behind the thornbrake, where nobody had reason to stand unless they were watching the enclosure unseen. wide heel, square toe, one nail missing from the left sole, leaving a little crescent in the dirt. Eli knelt beside it. That is Mr. Danner's boot. You are sure? He drives for Cale. He came to the schoolyard last month with freight. Same broken nail mark. I noticed because he tracks sideways when he walks. Clara looked at the boy. You noticed his boot nail a month ago. Eli shrugged. People leave more behind than they think. The next council meeting was crowded before it began. Briar Cut had become the kind of town where everyone pretended not to care what happened in official rooms, then stood outside the windows to hear. Dr. Vail gave the medical report first. No new severe cases in 12 days. 2 mild cases. No deaths since the rotation began. Then Fitch asked Victor Cale a question. Cale, at Bell's store you referenced a missing marked hen from Miss Wren's schoolhouse rotation. The hen was not missing. She was moved home and logged. Can you tell this council how you came by that description? Cale adjusted his cuff. As I said, I heard talk. Fitch opened Clara's ledger to the relevant page. The marking description appears here in a private flock log. It was not in the public reports. Briggs leaned forward. Are we holding court over a chicken? From the back? Abram Pike said. No. Over a man who wants control of a fever program and cannot explain why he knows things he should not know. A murmur passed through the room. Cale's face remained disciplined. But Clara saw what she needed to see. For months, he had been the one measuring other people's fear. Now the room was measuring him. Eli stepped forward only when Fitch called him. His coat was brushed badly. His hair had watercomb marks in it. He looked terrified, and more serious than terrified. He described the boot prints, the missing nail, where he had seen the same track before. He did not accuse, he reported. That made it worse for Cale. A child raging can be dismissed. A child giving clean evidence becomes a problem. Danner, the driver, was not in the room. That also became part of the problem. Cale tried to turn it. He talked about scale, professionalism, public safety, the danger of trusting a woman who had turned a private flock into a municipal necessity. And there, finally, Clara understood the shape of his fear. It was not the birds. It was not even the land. It was that the town had begun to survive without renting its survival from him. The council extended the rotation that night, then made it permanent in July, not unanimously. Briggs voted no. Cale said nothing and left before the room emptied. But the program continued. By late summer, the flock had grown to 49 birds. By autumn, 62. Hatchlings survived better because Eli built brush shelters in the exact places where the hens wanted to nest, instead of where people wanted them to nest. Host families learned to keep water shaded, grain dry, dogs away, and children from chasing what did not belong to them. The tick counts fell below danger levels across the first 5 properties. Then 8, then 12. The schoolhouse reopened the scrub yard. Bell cattle returned to the lower pasture. The public wash stopped functioning like a disease road and became a managed corridor with rotating birds, trimmed cover, and weekly counts pinned to the feed store wall where anyone could read them. Clara's farm changed too. The 14 acres no longer looked like land waiting to fail. It looked rough, yes. Still thorny, still stone-backed, still hard country. But the beds held. The slope carried native grass she had seeded by hand. The cabin had 2 repaired walls, then 3, then a roof that only leaked in hard sideways rain. Ruth sold Clara's beans through the mercantile. Fitch approved a small management stipend from the council. Dr. Vail sent visiting ranchers to her when they asked about tick control. And Abram Pike, who was growing slower by the month, still came to walk the land when his knees allowed it. One October afternoon, he stood beside Clara at the upper fence and watched the birds work the new grass. "Town says you knew from the start," he said. Clara snorted. "Town lies to make itself comfortable." He smiled. They forgot how hard they laughed. No, they did not forget. She looked down toward the main street, small in the distance. They decided remembering did not help them. Abram tapped his stick against a stone. You angry? Some days. And today I am busy. He laughed then, not much but enough. That winter, Clara bought the adjacent wash parcel that Cale had been trying to fold into his corridor. It took everything. The loan was ugly. The terms were tight. The flock itself was listed as collateral, which made her hand shake when she signed, though no one saw it. But she signed. 26 acres now. Still rough land. Still not easy land, but land whose logic she had begun to read. When she brought the new deed home, Eli unfolded the survey on the table and turned it sideways. Clara watched him. Maps work upright too, you know. Not this one. He traced the creek branch with one finger. This draw feeds under your lower bed. See? The water is already connected. The birds have been working close to that line for months. The new parcel is not starting from nothing. Clara leaned over the map. He was right. Again, how do you keep finding the part I miss? She asked. Eli thought about it seriously. I watched the birds before I knew why they mattered, he said. You watched the land because you had to save it. I watched the birds because they were strange, so I see where they want to go first. Clara sat with that after he left. The town had heard noise. She had heard pattern. But Eli had heard willingness. The birds did not solve the valley because they were magic. Everyone loved to make useful things sound mysterious after they started working. Guinea hens ate ticks. That was old knowledge. Abram's mother had known it. The widow in Rock County had known it. Any farmer who had kept the birds long enough to hate them honestly had known it. The rare thing was not the birds. The rare thing was letting them change the plan. Most people arrived on land with a method already loaded in their hands. Plow here, clear that, fence this, burn that, make the ground submit, and call submission improvement. Clara had not been wiser than those people. She had been poorer. She had lacked the money to force the wrong idea for very long, so she watched. She counted. She let an ugly, shrieking flock show her where the danger lived, where the soil could breathe, where the insects were not all enemies, where the wash was sick, where the town was connected to the land, even when it pretended the land was somewhere else. By the next spring, 2 county men came to see the Briar Cut rotation, then an agricultural officer, then a rancher from 80 miles west who admitted, after an hour of arguing, that his own tick problem sounded nearly identical. Clara wrote a guide that winter with Eli's name beside hers. He objected. I am 14, he said. You noticed the nesting problem before I did. That does not mean my name belongs on a paper for grown men. It means the paper would be false without it. He looked at his name a long time. Then he said very quietly, all right. Years later, people would tell the Briar Cut story in the simple way people prefer. A woman came with useless birds. The town laughed. The birds saved them. That version was clean. It moved well. It made listeners feel clever for knowing the laughers were wrong. But Clara never liked it. It made the birds into a miracle and the people into fools, and the truth was less tidy than that. The town had been afraid. Victor Cale had understood that fear and tried to purchase it. The council had hesitated because hesitation feels safer than being wrong in public. The farmers had laughed because laughter is easier than admitting that somebody with less money might be seeing something you missed. And Clara had not been certain. That mattered most. She had not crossed into Briar Cut with a secret victory in her pocket. She had crossed in with a bad deed, $38.60, 15 impossible birds, and a willingness to keep looking after everyone else had already decided what there was to see. The flock did not make the land gentle. The land never became gentle. It became understood. And once it was understood, it could be worked with. That was what Victor Cale could not buy, what the council could not appoint, what the town could not laugh into existence and could not borrow from any outside expert fast enough to save itself. Attention had to be paid in place, day after day. Count after count, track after track, bird by bird. On the first warm evening of the third spring, Clara stood at the upper fence with Eli beside her and watched 70 gray birds move across ground that had once been called worthless. The town lights were beginning to show below them. The public wash lay quiet. The schoolhouse yard was full of children again. Cattle grazed where they had once refused to step. Eli said, "They are still too loud." Clara listened to the harsh calls moving over the slope. "Yes," she said. Then after a moment, "But they were never just noise, and the birds kept working, ugly and unreasonable and right, carrying the pattern through the grass long after the laughter was gone."